We are in Hong Kong, in front of the Golden Bauhinia, symbol of Hong Kong handover to China. For indeed, on the 1st of July 1997, after more than 150 years of British colonial reign, Hong Kong was returned to China. In order to understand the process of that handover, let's dive into history. In 1842, after the First Opium War between British Empire and the aging Chinese Empire, a war easily won by British forces, Chinese and British signed together the Nanking or Nanjing Unfair Treaty, which gave to the British large commercial profits and also the tiny but most strategic island of Hong Kong, which was then ceded in perpetuity to the British Crown. A bit less than 20 years later, in 1860, following the Second Opium War which opposed China to both British and French forces, the Tianjin Treaty was signed, and the Kowloon Peninsula, small piece of land of about 12 square miles in front of Hong Kong Island, was given to the British. Finally, in 1898, after seeing their European rivals conquering pieces of China, the British signed with Beijing a 99 years lease, that is to say up to 1997, of a large part of the peninsula beyond Kowloon and several islands, which became known as the New Territories. For several decades, the British only saw in Hong Kong a strategic and valuable harbor, but it is only since the middle of the 20th century that Hong Kong economy started to really take off. The Hong Kong population grew up, and so did its standard of living, when the British decided that Hong Kong would become a strong financial center. On the other side of the border, 3 years after Mao Zedong's death, as Deng Xiaoping was applying economical policies drastically opposed to the communist ideology dominant until then, the handover issue of those territories leased to the British emerged. In theory, only the new territories are concerned by the lease and therefore must be returned. But the British know that the small Hong Kong island, even flanked by the little peninsula portion called Kowloon, cannot be a sustainable territory on long term. The fact that they must give back the entire colony is becoming more and more obvious. UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher then engaged a long discussion with Deng Xiaoping from 1982 to 1984 in order to get the most out of these negotiations. Not for England itself, which didn't have from then on anything left to win, but for Hong Kong people whose fate was worrying the entire international community. According to Deng Xiaoping's famous quote, "Yi Kuo Liang Zhi," the so-called one country, two systems, it has been decided that Hong Kong would be indeed handed over to China in 1997, but on the condition that Hong Kong would remain largely autonomous, and that for 50 years. Hong Kong being ruled until then by the British Constitution and in the impossibility to be ruled by the Chinese Constitution, a Hong Kong Constitution was thus created for the occasion, the Hong Kong Basic Law. A constitution which would be maintained and preserved until 2047. For many observers, it was potentially risky, but in the same time, it was a reasonable compromise. However, for a lot of Hong Kong people, the confirmation that within 15 years Hong Kong would be back under Chinese rule was terrible news. A large part of the population was composed of men and women who had fled the Chinese communist regime in the past decades, or of their children. That explains the massive waves of emigration which occurred in Hong Kong at that time. All for the worst, 5 years after sealing the handover agreements in 1989, Deng Xiaoping became responsible of the Tiananmen Square massacre, giving real reasons to fear 1997 in Hong Kong people's minds. And finally, the 1st of July 1997 came up. The governor appointed by the Queen of England gave the keys of Hong Kong to the chief executive appointed by Beijing, and everyone held their breath. Regarding the democracy, the British introduced an embryo of universal suffrage in the Hong Kong political system in 1995, thus initiating a movement that was supposed to be carried on after the handover. But in order to have a better understanding of the problematics, let's take a closer look at the political institutions in Hong Kong. At the head of the Hong Kong regional government, there is the chief executive. He is elected by an election committee made of 800 members and confirmed in his position by Beijing. This chief executive personally appoints the members of the government, the Executive Council. To monitor the government policies and to vote the laws, there is the Hong Kong legislature, the Legislative Council, in short, LT&GD. In the Hong Kong Basic Law, the Articles 45 and 68 stipulate respectively that the chief executive, as well as all the members of the Legislative Council, must eventually be elected by universal suffrage. Well, first, among the 60 members of this LT&GD, 30 are elected by functional constituencies formed of individuals and bodies coming from different fields of the Hong Kong economy. And only the 30 remaining ones are elected by universal suffrage within geographical constituencies in Hong Kong. Besides, the chief executive is elected by this election committee mentioned earlier. Among the 800 seats of this election committee, 664 are for the functional constituencies representatives. All the members of the LT&GD have their seats, namely the 30 legislators elected by the same functional constituencies and the 30 ones elected by the people. There are also 40 representatives of the main religions in Hong Kong, and finally 36 seats are for Beijing central government delegates. To sum up, far from being elected by universal suffrage as the constitution would have him, the head of the government of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region is elected by a committee made of less than 4% of members directly elected by the people, the half of the legislators among this LT&GD. Until its soon relocation into more modern facilities, this LT&GD is housed into the former Supreme Court of Hong Kong. It is in this building that we meet our first political guest, Lau Kong-Wah. After making his first steps in politics for the Democratic Party, he then allied the most important and most conservative pro-Beijing political party, the DAB. Moreover, he is now the vice chairman of the party, besides being a member of the Executive Council and of the LT&GD. Lau Kong-Wah first tells us what are the stakes in the universal suffrage.
I think the most important thing is there is a compromise between the central government and also the Democratic Party, right? They have a compromise, a consensus, and then we can have the new way forward. The new package has been passed in the LT&GD, but that is not the full stop of the political reform, because we should go ahead with the two universal suffrage in LT&GD and also in the election of chief executive. We have a timetable, and I hope that we can stick to the timetable and going towards democracy in Hong Kong.
Indeed, much remains to be done to respect the Constitution. After several delays, as Lau Kong-Wah just confirmed, the current administration has stated that the 2017 LT&GD elections and the 2020 chief executive elections will at last be held through universal suffrage. Let's now listen to someone coming from the other side of the political chessboard, one of the main public personalities in Hong Kong these past decades, the one who founded the Democratic Party in Hong Kong, where some call him the father of democracy, Martin Lee Chiu-Ming, now retired from political life. He tells us the importance of the democratic issue for Hong Kong.
We cannot lay at the door of Beijing for all the troubles which occurred since the 1st of July 1997, nor is democracy a cure for everything. But the advantage of democracy is that whichever party is in government, it will have the support of the people on controversial issues that would have been decided by the people at the last election. And so it would be much easier for a government to implement a policy which already has support of a large part of the community. Now, at the moment, the trouble with this administration and also the administration under Mr. Tong is that neither of the two chief executives has the mandate of the people. And instead of listening to the people of Hong Kong, who have not elected them, they must listen to Beijing, because without Beijing's support, they won't even have been there. Important decisions over Hong Kong are made by Beijing through their own Communist cadres in Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong government merely implements these policy decisions. And the liaison office orchestrates now all the elections at every level, including the chief executive. But ultimately, the ultimate aim is to have one person, one vote. But they kept on postponing the ultimate date. That's the problem.
And nowadays they are talking about 2017 for chief of executive and 2020 for the elections of the LegCo members.
But at the same time, they won't commit to genuine democracy.
So do you think they will postpone it again? You think?
I think what they have in mind is to control the electoral system. They want to control the nomination. In other words, they will have a nomination committee for the chief executive's election, but they make sure that they have the majority of the members on this nomination committee. Now, for example, there are 800 members on this nomination committee, and if they control more than 600, right? And then they say, if you want to run, you need the support of 100 of these people. So in theory, you could have as many as 8 candidates, right? 100 each out of 800. And then they will say, but there are too many. So all the members of this nomination committee will sit together and they will elect 2. And the 2 persons with the largest number of votes from the 800 people, of whom Beijing will control 600, effectively, Beijing will select 2 puppets for Hong Kong and then leave the 2 for Hong Kong people to elect by one person, one vote. But Beijing will effectively pick both. So they want to introduce the same system to the election of the functional constituency people. Each functional constituency will have similarly a nomination committee which Beijing will control. And the result is Beijing will control the chief executive election and will also control the result of the legislative council elections, because Beijing will always have the majority. That's what they're thinking about. And we push them to commit that they will give us genuine democracy, meaning if I have enough support of the Hong Kong people, I should be allowed to run as a candidate.
Beyond this attempt to tighten the Hong Kong political structures, Beijing's central government has tried several times since 1997 to directly interfere in Hong Kong politics, and that starting on the very first day, the 1st of July 1997. It has then been announced that the entire legislature, elected semi-democratically 2 years earlier, would be dissolved. Martin Lee describes now how he lived those events from the inside.
After midnight, the Democrats in the Legislative Council were all thrown out. Our places were taken over by people appointed by Beijing. And that photograph, in fact, was taken after midnight, after the ceremony. We went up to the balcony of the Legislative Council building, and then we made speeches to the people. There were 5,000 people. And in summary, I told the people, we shall return. Because our places will be taken over by Beijing's appointees for 1 year, and in 2008, there would be elections again. So we said, we will come back. We shall return. And return, we did.
Another interference attempt from Beijing in Hong Kong internal affairs had, however, much more consequences: the Article 23 case. In the Hong Kong Constitution, the Article 23 states that on full term, Hong Kong must apply policies which forbids any act of treason or subversion against the Chinese People's Central Government. any theft of state secret, or any link with foreign political organizations. And because of Beijing's insistence, through the Chinese President Hu Jintao, the Hong Kong government put forward a bill which was supposed to respect this Article 23. However, the quite authoritarian interpretation made with this proposition caused an enormous controversy among Hong Kong society. This bill would have allowed the police to search and arrest without warrants or evidences, only based on suspicion of treason or disclosure of state secret, or that any organization or association banned by Beijing, religious or civil, would automatically be banned in Hong Kong as well. Facing such risks, and in a social climate already darkened by serious economic difficulties and by the questionable management of the government during the recent SARS episode, the Hong Kong population actively protested against this reform, ending up gathering around 500,000 people, a tenth of the total population, in a massive protest march on the 6th anniversary of the Handover, the 1st of July 2003. In front of the obvious impossibility to pass the bill, the government moved back. The Secretary for Security Regina Ip and the Financial Secretary Anthony Leung resigned from their offices soon after. And less than 2 years later, after having clearly stated that the application of Article 23 would be postponed to an uncertain future, Lau Kong-Wah, the chief executive himself, resigned from his post. That is for the formal explanation, but what really happened in fact? Martin Lee tells us how the Article 23 controversy was probably born from a lack of communication from the chief executive, Lau Kong-Wah.
He could have done a much better job than that, because right after the huge demonstration, on the following day, the 2nd of July, all the Pan-Democrats, that is the legislators who belong to the Democratic camp, wrote him a letter. We wanted to see him and talk about that. And there was division in the pro-Beijing camp, because one party, the Liberal Party, said, you better postpone this thing indefinitely. But the other pro-Beijing party, the DAB, said, don't postpone, because there are elections coming, and we don't want to lose out in the elections. But you make major amendments to it. So the DAB would then propose amendments, 3 major amendments, which Mr. Tong himself actually proposed. He accepted the DAB's proposal. He announced the 3 major amendments. But he did not consult us beforehand. If he had consulted us beforehand, these are the 3 major amendments on the table. Will you support it? I would have said yes, and I think all the legislators would have agreed with it. That's a good idea. Then he could have passed the bill with support of all sides. But he refused to see us. So he announced the amendments, and the people said not good enough. And then he did not have our support. So he handled it very badly. But at the time when the Basic Law was being drafted, I was one of the people who was a member. I was a member of the drafting committee of the Basic Law, and I opposed the wording of that article, because at the time they actually changed it twice. The first time it was bad, then at my suggestion they changed it much better.
And it was before the Tiananmen incident?
Before Tiananmen Square it was fine, it was almost acceptable. But afterwards they changed it. So the law today is bad.
This influence from Beijing on Hong Kong affects other areas of the Hong Kong societies, for instance, culture. And to talk about those cultural aspects, let's take the most representative Hong Kong artistic field throughout the world, the cinema. In order to do that, let's now meet Herman Yau Lai-To, a Hong Kong filmmaker famous for a certain artistic and social touch, among other things. He also tells us about at least one attempt from Beijing to interfere into cultural issues the year right before the handover.
In 1996, there's a meeting about literature, artwork, something like that. Many artists, they gather in Changsha, and there's a meeting held by Zhang Jianming.
The conference about art and literature that was held in 1996 in Changsha was indeed an opportunity for Chinese authorities to pass on their message to Hong Kong producers and investors. It is during that year that the former president of China, Jiang Zemin, strongly encouraged film studios to produce, I quote, more war movies to pay tribute to revolutionary heroism and patriotism.
After the Changsha meeting, the Beijing government they want the film people to make at least 10 films of that kind each year. And so, since the main film films become the mainstream in the film market, and naturally most of the audience they won't like to watch those films. So the film industry during those four years is quite calm. We foresee some of the difficulties maybe because we are quite aware that there will be kind of censorship. But actually this didn't happen really. And actually the so-called freedom at the beginning, the early years after the Handover, it seems unchanged. But for now, to me, I can sense kind of censorship, but not in the ordinary way, or a lot like the way that censorship was imposed to the citizens. Now everything has transformed into an economic way. For example, now we have a lot of joint production in the movie industry. So it seems Hong Kong films can go into the market of mainland easily. But in order to have the film screened in the mainland, the film has to go sent to the censorship board. So this, the execution of censorship is not like it's not the orthodox meaning of censorship now, or the method or the way the censorship is being as an instrument of governance. It's not like the way that we understood a long time ago.
As we clearly see it, those direct interference attempts failing almost every time, new methods are now used, more indirect ones, among them economic ways. Let's take a closer look at the major economical events that occurred in Hong Kong since 1997. First of all, at the time of the handover, Hong Kong, one of the 4 Asian tigers, had a powerful economy. The 7th largest harbor in the world, the 6th stock exchange market worldwide, Hong Kong had a lot of assets and was one of the most prosperous cities in Asia and even in the world. But beyond the one country, two systems, how does the most liberal society in the capitalist world go under the rule of a communist regime? And seeing nowadays Chinese leaping economy, how does the little tiger survive since the great dragon has awakened? In Hong Kong, the day following the handover was a dark one, for it is on that day that bursted the Asian economic crisis. Without any other link than an odd coincidence, on the 2nd of July 1997, the Thailandese baht collapsed because of a financial bubble, causing a major crisis which, from Thailand, spreaded really fast. Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and then Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and even India. The Hong Kong values dropped and speculators around the world started to attack the Hong Kong dollar. It is only after a harsh financial battle from the Hong Kong government that the situation began to stabilize and that things went finally back to normal at the end of year 1998, although major damages had been caused in the process. China, on the other side, was more or less spared by this crisis and, on the contrary, did nothing but soar economically speaking. Large cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Chongqing or Guangzhou exploded in terms of demography, urbanization and economic progress. The proof is that between 1981 and 2004, the amount of people living under the poverty line in China dropped from 75% of the total population to less than 15%. The revenues of middle-class workers in a mega-city like Chongqing has, for instance, increased tenfold between 1998 and 2008. In short, economically, while Hong Kong was stagnating, China, on the contrary, kept growing. On the 29th of June 2003, Hong Kong and Beijing signed the CEPA, or CEPA, for Closer Economic Partnership Arrangement. along with decisions that made easier for Chinese and Hong Kong people to travel in both directions, and with a few tax drops between the two, those arrangements greatly improved both sides in the following years. Unfortunately, the first half of 2003 in Hong Kong has also been marked by the SARS pandemic which struck Southeastern Asia. Hundreds of infectious cases, several dozens of deaths, and most importantly, a huge wave of panic caused a major blow in Hong Kong economy. A few years later, in July 2007, the subprimes crisis bursted in the USA, causing the fall 2008 crash, which globally spreaded an unprecedented economic crisis. However, Hong Kong, most likely thanks to the Chinese momentum, was quite quick to deal with the first episodes of that crisis without too much damage. Nowadays, although it has serious competitors, mostly Shanghai, Hong Kong remains by far the richest city in China and one of the richest in Asia. The best evidence of that is its GDP in purchasing power parity, which is 50% superior to Europe's and almost equal to USA GDP. Lau Kong-Wah shares with us his point of view on Hong Kong economic situation.
I don't say that it is the whole 13 years is a good time. No, because we have a lot of recession and crisis, especially in 1998. Right, the financial crisis in Asia, right? And then last year, 10 years later, and then financial crisis in the whole world. But if you do the comparison with Hong Kong to other countries, right, in the past 10 years or 13 years, we are facing the same problem, even in France, right? The GDP drop, right? The unemployment rate going up. So we are setting in this situation, we think that it is the truth, it is another way around, because we have the mainland China, because China is the main engine in the past 13 years.
And do you think if Hong Kong was alone or under British rule, it would be weaker to those financial crises?
Of course, it will be weaker.
It appears that the harmonization between Chinese and Hong Kong economic systems has two consequences. First, China being a tremendous financial engine, Hong Kong draws large economic profits. But secondly, this interpenetration gives more and more power to Chinese assets, public or private. And in front of this growing control from China, economically or not, Hong Kong autonomy is questioned. This autonomy promised by the one country, two systems, was it respected in Hong Kong? And is it nowadays? And that on a general point of view, or more precisely concerning freedom of speech or freedom of press.
If you look at the history of China, not Hong Kong, you can see that China is a very big country. In the boundary, along the boundary, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan is in the boundary. Most of them, all of them, have some special treatment. There may be some special policy to Xinjiang, to Tibet, to Taiwan, and to Hong Kong. So look at the history of China. It is too big, right? We have the core part in China, but in the boundary, right, we may have some special treatment and policy. Because you can look at Tibet, right? The head of Tibet, he should be the Tibetan. Xinjiang, the same. Maybe later in Taiwan is the same. So the treatment, the special policy of central government will be the same.
Compared to, for example, a Chinese filmmaker, do you as a Hong Kong filmmaker, are you still able to make some films that wouldn't be able to be made in mainland China? Is there still another?
Yes. Because even some of the investors, at least once in a while, they want to make some films that will appeal to the Hong Kong audience taste. But in order to make this kind of so-called local films and not taking the mainland as market, we have to keep the budget low in order to secure the return of money of the investor.
Press freedom is still okay in Hong Kong, but there are maybe only 2 newspapers, both Chinese newspapers, which would dare to criticize Beijing. All the other newspapers would criticize the Hong Kong government, but they won't dare criticize Beijing.
By self-censorship, you think?
Because all these newspapers, their proprietors, have business in mainland China, so they won't dare.
Beyond economical issues, Hong Kong is a very different city compared to other Chinese megacities. We tried to discover what are those particularities that make of Hong Kong a unique place in China.
The most spoken kind of depiction is that Hong Kong is the window of mainland to the world. And also, in a sense, Hong Kong is more adapted to the Western way of lifestyle, economics, and way of thinking, or something like that. And when mainland China is changing to be more and more capitalistic, and Hong Kong is kind of example that the mainland people can see their future.
Well, I hope that China one day will be like Hong Kong now. And the one important difference between Hong Kong and the other Chinese cities is the rule of law. We have the rule of law. So that means if ordinary people cannot do something, neither can high government official. And if they can do that, so can we. That is the rule of law. We are all equal before the law. Now in China, if you're a Communist Party cadre, you can do anything. If you're ordinary citizens, away with it. Now, this rule of law is here, not there. So the rule of law is going to separate Hong Kong from Chinese cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen, because I think investors would still prefer to do business in Hong Kong. They are sure of what happens. Right? But without democracy in Hong Kong, I'm afraid we may well lose our rule of law. Then it's bad. And Hong Kong will be dragged down.
The world is flat now, right? So the connection between China and the Western world is very, very important. And then Hong Kong is lying in the middle because of the history. So that is the unique city in the whole world. Especially, we may find that in the next century or in this century, the momentum will be going to Asia, right? And China is a very important country in Asia, right? And then Hong Kong is in the middle one. If you look at the map of Asia, if you look at the whole map of Asia, Hong Kong is in the middle. So that is our unique way in two senses. One is history, one is the location.
If Hong Kong is historically a pathbreaker, a laboratory city within the vast China world, what about its role for democratic questions? Would it be the same? After all, Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao's statements about a possible establishment of local elections show that China may be more open on these issues than expected. Nevertheless, could Hong Kong, with its unique quality, show the way of democracy to the rest of China? Martin Lee tries now to convince us.
When Deng Xiaoping came up with this idea of one country, two systems, he also said, for 50 years. And then when we were drafting the Basic Law, in April 1987, there was one occasion when Deng Xiaoping called for all the drafting members, all the drafting committee members, to have a meeting with him in Beijing. And on that occasion he said to us, if 50 years should not be enough, you could have another 50 years. So I thought, why? Then later on, I believe I've got the answer. Because when Deng Xiaoping first came up with this idea of one country, two systems, it was the early 1980s. And he had just opened up the economy the China market for overseas investments. And he was obviously looking at Hong Kong, and he obviously liked what he saw in Hong Kong, because there he saw a Chinese community with freedoms, with the rule of law, with a level playing field for business. No democracy, but good, prosperous and stable. So obviously he wanted China to develop like Hong Kong, because in the back of his mind, he obviously did not like communism, right? So he wanted Hong Kong, which is a capitalist system, to continue to move forward and lead China forward like a train engine. And he said 50 years because I believe in his mind he thought China would take probably 50 years to catch up with us. So we continue to go forward. 50 years, no change, everything. And China would take 50 years to catch up with us. And then in 1987, when he said, if it's not good enough, we'll give you another 50. What he meant was, if we cannot catch up with you in 50 years' time, we still don't want to drag you back in 2047. We still want you to continue. And we'll take another 50 years to catch up with you. And then China will be like Hong Kong. So that was the whole idea. But it's not working because the Chinese leadership now is so worried about democracy for Hong Kong. Maybe they are worried about democracy for China. But they don't have the vision and the courage of Deng Xiaoping. Many years ago, in fact, Deng Xiaoping said something which I want to give to you now. He said, with a good system, even evil men cannot do evil. But without a good system, even good men cannot do good, but may be forced to do evil. Now, China doesn't have a good system. Hong Kong doesn't have a good system. That's why even good men like our chief executive, like the leaders of China, they can't do good. That is a problem, right? So China should look ahead. There's the corruption, and there's a lot of unhappiness. Some people are very rich, and who are these people? These are the sons and daughters of high-ranking communist officials. 95% of these billionaires in China are what we call princelings. Princelings. And if Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao, if they had been elected by the Chinese people, they can do anything they want. They say, all right, we want to get rid of corruption. Right? We won't allow that anymore. And if you look at Hong Kong, corruption is very well controlled, very well under control in Hong Kong. Right? So China should follow. Hong Kong used to be a very corrupt city, but now we have the ICAC, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and we change our laws, and we increase the salaries of our civil servants, and we prosecute everybody if you commit any offense. And then we gave an amnesty. We announced an amnesty and forgiving people of their past corrupt deeds. Right? We drew a line there. So that is exactly there. It's a very good, successful example for China.
For China to follow.
Yeah.
It is clear that since 1997, Hong Kong has faced a lot of difficulties, and that in all areas of society. An economic downturn, a political tightening, a cultural weakening, and so on. On the other hand, it is also clear, first, that all those problems are not direct consequences of the handover only, but also of many external factors, mostly economic. Then, that Hong Kong still has a certain autonomy. And lastly, that beyond geopolitics, there is indeed a Chinese root in Hong Kong, which gives to the handover to China the feeling of a logical and natural return. But what about democracy? The process planned for the handover is obviously failing. And we understood that behind the issue of universal suffrage lies the problematic of the candidate's nomination, and beyond, the weakness of all the electoral system. Furthermore, there is also this 2047 deadline, after which Hong Kong autonomy is supposed to end. We now decide to ask our guests about the future of democracy in Hong Kong. And for the first of those questions at least, which is, should people be afraid of 2047 in Hong Kong? It is amusing to observe the difference between each answer.
I don't think that there will be any big problem that year.
I think you don't have to wait until 2047 to see trouble.
I think those when the Sino-British declaration about 50 years unchanged is just kind of rhetoric, kind of wordings. Actually, because this statement is contradicting to reality. Because when they said that Hong Kong will have capitalism being kept for the coming 50 years, but actually when that statement was announced, capitalism was undergoing a big change, from the Fordism to the flexible accumulation, something like that. So when you say we keep some things unchanged, actually that thing is changing. So I won't take that kind of statement seriously. It's kind of comforting the Hong Kong people and comforting those countries. They are trying to interfere for the mainland rhetoric, or they want to help in the local rhetoric, the Hong Kong people.
Without the free flow of information, how can Hong Kong be a financial center? No way. So we're going to suffer. And without democracy, how long can we preserve our freedoms under the rule of law? Because our freedoms are protected by law, but the laws are made by the legislature and they're proposed by the government. And if the chief executive continues to be Beijing's man, he will propose draconian legislation, or legislation which will cut down on our freedoms. And once the law permits the state to erode our freedoms, how can the courts protect our freedoms? Because the courts must administer the law as they find it. And if we, the legislature, if our legislature were to pass a law like Article 23, our freedoms would have gone, and the courts can't help. And that is why we must have democracy as soon as possible. And my hope is that we are going downhill, certainly, because of this present attitude of Beijing. But China is catching up. China is going up. Now, the important point is, where are we going to converge? If we come down a lot to converge, it's bad for Hong Kong, bad for China. But if we keep more or less up there, and if China then converge with us, then it will be good for China and not too bad for Hong Kong. Of course, if we could move forward, and China can go like that, that's the best.
I hope we can go back to something like the 1980s or even 70s, in the sense that we can make different kinds or different genres of movies freely. And then I hope that the mainland government, they will one day recognize that film is not so negative in political sense.
Now, we will continue to fight for democracy in Hong Kong, and China will keep delaying it. China will only give democracy to Hong Kong if the Chinese leaders are convinced that if Hong Kong people were to be given the vote, the Hong Kong people will elect what Beijing wants to win, then we elect. When that day comes, China will be happy to give democracy to Hong Kong. Otherwise, China will not. Now, what's going to happen depends on also the international community. Because if little Hong Kong were to fight with the giant China mania, we have no hope. But the international community, I think, is important. Because when the Sino-British Joint Declaration was first announced on the 25th of September 1984, all the governments in the world came up to support it. Now, it was none of their business. It was only an agreement between Britain and China. Why did the French government, why did the US government and the Japanese government come out to support it? Because both the British and the Chinese governments worked very hard behind the scenes. They were lobbying for international support of the Joint Declaration, so that when it was announced, they wanted Hong Kong people to support it. Otherwise, there will be a lot of massive immigration. It's like bleeding, right? The crème de la crème of Hong Kong people will be all leaving Hong Kong. And they did a good job, so they got the international support. And now that the French government and the other governments have supported the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, that was clearly on the basis that Hong Kong would soon have democracy. So I do say every foreign government owes Hong Kong people at least a moral obligation to speak up and ask the Beijing government, why are you postponing democracy for Hong Kong? You promised that, not only to the Hong Kong people, but to us in the international community. Why do you keep on postponing it? What is the answer?
The two main facts that we were able to clear about Hong Kong's future in the next decades are first that beyond simple local specialties, Hong Kong will always remain a unique place in China. And secondly, that as Hong Kong is coming closer and closer to China, so does China towards Hong Kong, in a symmetric rapprochement. What remains unclear, as Martin Lee told us, is on which level of social justice will the two of them converge. Besides, as we saw with Lau Kong-Wah, even the most conservative politicians support the idea of democracy for Hong Kong. The problem is that Beijing isn't obviously eager to see universal suffrage landing in Hong Kong tomorrow, probably by fear of contagion to all China. A fear that is most likely justified because Hong Kong, real pioneer, often draws China behind, whether it is economically speaking, socially, or even politically. It is therefore reasonable to think that the establishment of universal suffrage in Hong Kong could indeed spread a democratic wave throughout China, which would be profitable to China itself in the first place, but also to all its partners in the world. Finally, we saw that if in 1984 Deng Xiaoping would have announced the handover with the sole support of the British, foreign investors and Hong Kong citizens would simply have fled the peninsula. Without the support of Western countries at that time, China would only have received from Hong Kong an empty shell. Maybe it is now time, almost 30 years after this favor, that the same Western powers remind to the current Chinese administration that this help wasn't free of all counterpart. It was only Beijing's democratic promises towards Hong Kong that pushed those foreign nations to vouch for this handover. Yet, those promises remain unfulfilled. Those countries from the international community have therefore on this matter the right to demand explanations from Chinese leaders. It is not about pushing China towards democracy from the outside, nor about interfering in its internal affairs like on Taiwan or Tibet, but to settle for diplomatically convincing China in its own interest, especially financial, to respect and enforce the democratic commitments that has been made between China and UK for Hong Kong and blessed by the international community, which would be favoring a wonderful democratic seed to sprout from the inside. And because of China's superpower, Such a thing, while being good for China itself, would also be positive for the whole world, but more especially for Hong Kong.